This is the Kofford Books AuthorCast. I'm your host, Brian Whitney. Laura Harris Hales is a freelance copy editor, author, and educator. She received a bachelor's degree in international relations from Brigham Young University and a master's degree in professional writing from New England College. Brian Hales is a board-certified anesthesiologist in Layton, Utah, and graduated from Utah State University. He is the award-winning author of 6 books on Mormon polygamy, including a 3-volume series on the history and theology of Joseph Smith's polygamy. Along with his wife, Laura, he maintains josephsmithspolygamy.org. In Joseph Smith's Polygamy Toward a Better Understanding, Brian and Laura wade through the murky waters of history to help bring some clarity to this episode of Mormonism's past, examining both the theological explanations of the practice and accounts of those who've experienced it firsthand. This volume also includes short biographies of the 36 women who were married to the prophet, but whose stories of faith, struggle, and courage have largely been forgotten and ignored over time. While we may never fully understand the details and reasons surrounding this practice, Brian and Laura provide readers with an accessible, forthright, and faithful look into this challenging topic, helping readers to come to a better understanding. In this episode, Brian will read the introduction, and Laura will read 3 biographical sketches of women who were involved with Joseph Smith's polygamy.
In 2014, while we were traveling in San Antonio on public transportation, a man entered the bus at one of the stops and sat down next to us. With Bible in hand, he immediately engaged us in a conversation about Christ. We could not identify his accent, but soon learned he was from Bangkok, Thailand, and was attending school in the United States. He reflected conviction and faith, which we admired, as we told him we were also Christians and members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He said he was unfamiliar with our church, so we later added that it was sometimes called the Mormon Church. He received that statement with a blank stare, but 5 minutes later he interrupted our conversation by asking, "Aren't Mormons the ones with more wives?" It appeared the only thing this young man knew about our church was that members once practiced polygamy. Church leaders would probably see this as unfortunate. If the church is to be known internationally for one quality or trait, the past practice of earthly plural marriage would probably not be a first choice. Our previous research into polygamy allowed us to answer his questions regarding the practice. It is unlikely, however, that the average Latter-day Saint would have been able to offer us detailed information about the only thing he apparently knew regarding our church. Ironically, one of the teachings for which the church may be best known throughout the world is a practice whose details and history have been seldom discussed by members themselves during the past century. This paradox may be due to several factors. First, there are only a limited number of historical sources that discuss the early practice of plural marriage. In the past few decades, important manuscripts have become available, but overall the documentation is less than historians would prefer. Second, most church members have not chosen to study the subject in depth. This may be because many saints find the practice of polygamy to be repugnant. Their reactions to the principle lead them to ignore it rather than to familiarize themselves with it. Third, writers who do not believe Joseph Smith's teachings have portrayed him and his behaviors according to their biases rather than presenting information that accurately reflects the historical record. This creates confusion rather than clarity. There is only one document by Joseph Smith specifically discussing the subject of polygamy. His revelation recorded on July 12, 1843, now Doctrine and Covenants 132. In addition, no contemporary records of his teachings have been found except for a few entries in the journal of his clerk, William Clayton. Consequently, the primary source of reliable information concerning Joseph Smith's polygamy comes from later recollections written by those in Nauvoo who were personally involved. Some of the available manuscripts contain brief references to polygamy that are found in longer autobiographical sketches, while others constitute reminiscence of distinct plural marriage events from the 1840s. Later recollections are far less desirable than contemporary accounts for many reasons. Historian Maureen Ursenbach Beecher provided this depressing view of late reminiscence. Quote, personal texts are the fictions we create in order to make our lives acceptable to ourselves and our imagined readers. Our memories are often flawed and distorted, as people discover when they share their version of a particular event with that of a sibling or a spouse. In addition, by omissions, by evasions, or by outright untruths, we reshape events to our liking. End of quote. Problems with late recollections plague every historical reconstruction that employs them. For instance, while compiling accounts for the 6-volume History of the Church only 12 years after Joseph's death, Wilford Woodruff lamented, quote, we almost daily get new statements from men who were directly or indirectly connected with the scenes of the last 4 days of the lives of the prophet and patriarch, end of quote. He added, quote, many of these accounts are in direct opposition to each other, end of quote. Sadly, perhaps 90% of the available evidences dealing with Joseph Smith's polygamy fall into this category. Researchers have generally relied on 3 collections of statements and testimonies by Nauvoo polygamists, which were accumulated in response to the 19th century claims by the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, RLDS, that Joseph Smith did not teach or practice plural marriage. The first was composed in 1869 in anticipation of RLDS missionaries heading to Salt Lake City. At that time, Apostle Joseph F. Smith acquired a total of 58 separate affidavits of the prophet's engagement with polygamy. 15 of those were from Joseph Smith's plural wives, and all were designed to show that the prophet initiated plural marriage among the Latter-day Saints. 7 years later, independent historian Andrew Jensen, unaware of Joseph F. Smith's affidavits, sought to oppose RLDS claims through his own efforts by interviewing numerous Nauvoo polygamists and recording their statements and narratives. Many of these were later published in his private magazine, The Historical Record, which included a list of 27 of the prophet's polygamous wives. The third significant source of information is comprised of testimonies that were recorded in litigation between the RLDS Church and the Church of Christ, also called Hebrakites. In 1891, the RLDS Church, led by Joseph Smith III, sued the Church of Christ, disputing its claim to own the temple lot in Independence, Missouri, that Edward Partridge, acting for the church, had purchased in 1831. The Church of Christ held physical possession of the lot at that time, but the RLDS Church took the official position that it was the true successor of the church originally founded by Joseph Smith and was thus the rightful owner of the property. Although the LDS Church was not party to the suit, it provided support to the Church of Christ, saying that if it could prove that plural marriage was a part of the church led by Joseph Smith, then the RLDS Church could not be the true successor, since it failed to practice such a key doctrine. The trial court for the Western District of Missouri ruled in favor of the Reorganized Church, but the United States Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the ruling, and the Church of Christ retained the property. Even though they were also staunchly opposed to plural marriage, and seem to have only pursued polygamy as a line of inquiry for strategic purposes. In addition to these 3 collections, other men and women who learned of and participated in Nauvoo polygamy left documents, narratives, and testimonials. Unfortunately, the combined available documentation still leaves important questions unresolved. These limitations, however, do not prevent the compilation of a reliable reconstruction of what likely took place. Latter-day Saints' reluctance to study plural marriage. Besides problems with documentation, several additional factors seem to have contributed to the lack of understanding among Latter-day Saints. The first is the church leaders have in the past concentrated on teaching basic principles of the gospel, which have resulted in a very limited number of discussions on this subject. Today, however, the Internet has perpetuated the distribution of teachings irrespective of their accuracy. Accordingly, the need to talk more openly about this topic has increased in order to counter the many distortions being accessed by curious readers regarding Joseph Smith's polygamy. A second dynamic may also contribute to the reticence of many members to study plural marriage teachings. Despite the fact that the revelation on the subject is part of the current Doctrine and Covenants, the idea of a woman sharing her husband with another wife, even if sanctioned by God, is so distasteful to most sisters and brethren that there has been little inclination by many to explore these concepts. Even in Joseph Smith's lifetime, the most common reaction to the teaching was negative. Eliza Snow, the second General Relief Society president, recalled, quote, "When the first plural marriage was suggested to me, I would not listen to the matter. The idea was repugnant and abhorrent. I was like any other woman who had beaux and suitors for her hand. I wanted to share a husband with no woman," end of quote. When Apostle John Taylor learned of the principle of plural marriage in the summer of 1841, he recalled that he and other members of the Quorum of the 12, quote, "were in no great hurry to enter into it." He also remembered at that time, when men were commanded to take more wives, it made us pull pretty long faces sometimes. It was not so easy as one might think. When it was revealed to us, it looked like the last end of Mormonism, end of quote. Similarly today, though plural marriage is not required in order for church members to receive all of God's blessings, it can be a difficult topic to discuss. From a mortal standpoint, the practice does not seem to be fair, because polygamy expands a man's emotional and sexual opportunities as a husband as it simultaneously diminishes a woman's emotional and sexual opportunities as a wife. We might speculate that in the celestial kingdom, plural wives will not feel any different from monogamous wives because Heavenly Father is just, but those details have not been revealed. The third factor contributing to this lack of accurate understanding among Latter-day Saints regarding plural marriage is the biases of authors who have written on the topic. The limited number of documents discussing the introduction of plural marriage at Nauvoo provides many opportunities for writers to interpret the evidence. In doing so, the individual biases of the authors unavoidably color their published analyses, whether critical or sympathetic. Consider the story of a woman who lies asleep in a room at midnight. A masked man enters the room, grabs a knife, and plunges it deep into the woman's abdomen. A few minutes later, she has bled to death. With this description, many might conclude the poor woman had been murdered in her sleep by an intruder. In actuality, the woman was an anesthetized patient in an operating room, and the man with the knife, or more properly a scalpel, was a vascular surgeon performing an emergency operation to stop internal bleeding from severe abdominal trauma. Unfortunately, his earnest efforts were unsuccessful. Undeniably, the way a story is told can influence the perception of what occurred, even transforming skilled physicians into murderers. Since Latter-day Saint authors have written little about Joseph Smith's polygamy in the past century, most of the books and articles written currently available have been authored by writers who do not believe his revelations and teachings. This absence of belief has unavoidably influenced their assumptions and their deductions, and some publications carry overt anti-Mormon messages. Joseph Smith is ultimately portrayed as a fraud, adulterer, and hypocrite, but it is questionable whether that description is due to historical documentation or author bias. In this book, we have done our best to fit together the puzzle pieces of the early practice of polygamy in the church. Because of poor documentation, there are gaps and holes that leave the picture incomplete. Admittedly, like all historians, we are not bias-free in this process. Nevertheless, our examination of the historical record has reinforced our convictions that Joseph Smith was a virtuous man and a true prophet of God.
Subscribers to our newsletter will receive a free ebook copy of Common Ground, Different Opinions, Latter-day Saints and Contemporary Issues, edited by Justin F. White and James E. Falconer. There are many hotly debated issues about which many people disagree, and where common ground is hard to find, from evolution to environmentalism, war and peace, to political partisanship, same-sex marriage to stem cell research. How we think about controversial issues affects how we interact as Latter-day Saints. In this volume, various Latter-day Saint authors address these and other issues from differing points of view. Though they differ on these tough questions, they have all found common ground in the gospel of Jesus Christ and in the Latter-day Restoration. Their insights offer diverse points of view while demonstrating that we can still love those with whom we disagree. We truly appreciate your ongoing support and hope that you will find this book to be valuable and informative. To subscribe to our newsletter and receive your free ebook, visit gregkofford.com.
I will be reading 3 biographical sketches at the end of our book. The first one is of Desdemona Fulmer, who was sealed to Joseph Smith in July of 1843. On October 6, 1809, Desdemona Fulmer was born to Peter Fulmer and Susanna Zerfoss in Huntington, Pennsylvania. The Fulmer family settled south of Cleveland, Ohio in 1835, and Desdemona was converted and baptized 2 years later. Desdemona moved to Nauvoo, and according to the Nauvoo Fourth Ward records, was living in Joseph Smith's home in the spring of 1842. Desdemona married Joseph Smith in July 1843. She gave this brief account of her sealing. Having been convinced of the truth of polygamy, I therefore entered into the order, but I dared not make it known, not even to my parents, for I was forbidden by the prophet, for it would endanger the life of Joseph, and also many of the saints. She also reported a night vision in which an angel told her that the polygamy doctrine was true. At the time Joseph Smith taught Desdemona about plural marriage, she remembered Hiram expressed his suspicions. After I moved out of Brother Joseph's house, Sister Hiram Smith, Mary Fielding Smith, wanted me to come for the winter with her to work tailoring, as that is trade. And while I was living at their house, Hiram had by some way learned something about polygamy. So one evening, while the family of us were sitting around the fire, he said to me, "I will ask you a fair question. Will you answer me?" "Yes, sir, Brother Hiram," I said. He said, "Supposing Brother Joseph would say to you that he had a revelation from God that it was right for him to have another wife besides Emma, would you believe it was of God?" Perhaps caught off guard by Hiram's direct methods, Desdemona quickly recovered by asking Hiram if he believed Joseph Smith was a prophet. He answered yes. Then she gave her opinion that since Joseph is a prophet, she cannot pick and choose which revelations she will believe. There the conversation ended. The next morning he, Hiram, made mention of the subject in the following words: "If I knew that any or thought that any woman in my house believed in such doctrine as polygamy, I would kick them 40 rods from my house and follow them and kick them still further." Soon after that, I made tracks, not feeling it safe to stay there any longer, and went to another place to live. That she would fear her safety, even from Joseph's brother, is somewhat surprising, yet it is an indicator of the revulsions felt by even some of Joseph's staunchest supporters to the idea of plural marriage. Even devout members struggled accepting the practice, thus requiring absolute secrecy on the part of pluralists. On May 26, 1843, William Clayton recorded, "Hiram received the doctrine of priesthood." Shortly after his change of heart, Hiram returned to Desdemona, whom he had earlier threatened. Quote, "Afterwards, brothers Joseph and Hiram came along and called there, and Brother Hiram wanted to talk with me and said, 'Do you remember how I talked when you were at my house?' 'Yes, sir, I do.' He said, 'Now I have come to make it right with you. I hurt your feelings, I ask your forgiveness, and where I have said anything against the doctrine of polygamy, in public or in private, I must take it all back, for the Lord has shown unto me that I was wrong and that Joseph was right.' Then he, Hiram, preached to me and exhorted me much, and said that I had done God's service, and for me to hold on to the faith that was taught me by Joseph, and much more he said to me on the subject, that I cannot write. She kept her word and remained true to her testimony to Joseph Smith and to the church. Desdemona migrated to Utah with the Saints and died in 1886, a lifelong member. Martha McBride, sealed summer 1842. On March 17, 1805, Martha McBride was born in Chester Township, New York, the fifth child of Daniel McBride and Abigail Meade. Martha married Vincent Knight on July 26, 1826, and the two were converted in 1834 after meeting the prophet. They moved to Kirtland, Ohio the following year, where they stayed until the spring of 1838. Then they migrated to Missouri, where they stayed for less than 2 years before moving to Nauvoo by October of 1839. Vincent Knight served as a bishop in Nauvoo and also assisted the prophet's own family. If Brother Joseph were away, it was he who looked after the wants of Joseph's family. He was always ready to look after the widows and orphans. Sometime before his untimely July 31, 1842 death, Vincent was sealed to a plural wife. A late second-hand account relates, quote, Martha was told by Joseph Smith that she was the first woman to give her consent for her husband to enter into plural marriage. The story is told that Martha knew something was worrying her husband, and he couldn't seem to tell her about it. One evening, as Martha was sitting in the grape arbor behind the house, Vincent returned home carrying a basket. He explained to Martha that he had taken some fruit and vegetables to the widow of Levi N. Merrick, whose husband had been killed at Haun's Mill. Vincent explained to Martha that he had been told to enter plural marriage, and that, if he had to, this Sister Merrick would be the one he could help best. Martha's reply is said to have been, "Is that all?" Concerning Vincent's plural marriage, church member Hiram Belknap remembered, "At the time plural marriage was reviled, there was difficulty to find persons that would consent to go into it on the female side. Martha Knight says the prophet Joseph told her that she was the first one who consented to her husband to have another wife, and her husband Vincent Knight did take another woman and was sealed to her, a Mrs. Merrick." Martha McBride Knight signed an 1869 affidavit declaring that, quote, "In the summer of the year 1842 at the city of Nauvoo, county of Hancock, state of Illinois, she was married or sealed to Joseph Smith, president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, by Heber C. Kimball, one of the 12 apostles in said church, according to the law of the same regulating marriage," unquote. Martha's affidavit does not specify whether the sealing to the prophet in 1842 was just for time, because she was then sealed to Vincent for time and eternity vicariously, or whether she was sealed to Joseph Smith for time and eternity. Regardless, in the Nauvoo Temple on January 26, 1846, Martha was sealed for eternity to Joseph Smith by proxy. If she had been previously sealed to Vincent, then who should be regarded as her eternal husband is not entirely clear. Even today, a deceased woman is permitted to be sealed by proxy to all the men with whom she lived as a legal wife during mortality, after her husbands have passed away. Joseph Smith emphasized that women have the right to choose their husbands without coercion. Since Martha can be the eternal mate of only one man, it is obvious that some sorting out of these timeless issues will need to occur during the millennium prior to the resurrection. The authority to bind on earth for eternity is also capable of unbinding. Martha McBride Knight affirmed in 1869 that her sealing to Joseph Smith occurred in the summer of the year 1842. Her obituary was more precise and specified August 1842. Martha migrated to Utah with the Saints, and in April 1877 attended the dedication of the St. George Temple, where she performed ordinance work for many of her deceased ancestors. On November 20, 1901, she died in Hooper at the home of her daughter, Adeline. Ruth Vose, sealed February 1843. Born February 26, 1808, in Watertown, Massachusetts, Ruth Vose was one of 2 children of Mark and Sally Vose. Baptized by Brigham Young in August of 1836, Ruth married non-member Edward Sayers on January 23, 1841. The Times and Seasons reported in St. Louis, Missouri, January 23rd, by Elder A. P. Rockwell, Mr. E. Sayers to Miss Ruth D. Vose, formerly of Boston, Massachusetts. Joseph Smith became closely associated with the Sayers when hiding from Missouri lawmen in August of 1842. After evading the Missouri sheriff, Joseph, quote, proceeded through the timber to Brother Sayers' house, where he was very kindly received and made welcome, unquote. William Clayton recorded, on the 11th August 1842, the sheriffs returned, but the prophet had concluded to keep out of their reach, and consequently they could not find him. The sheriff tarried in Nauvoo several days, frequently uttering heavy threats to be executed if the president failed to give himself up, but the officer finally concluded to leave the city. The president remained secure at Brother Sayers of the north of the city, about a mile from the corporation, where he was visited frequently by Sister Emma and his brethren. Apparently Joseph Smith believed that the officers would be less inclined to search the home of a non-member. During the stay, the prophet became good friends with Edward, although Ruth's husband felt no desire to convert. In 1869, Ruth signed an affidavit that reads, "Be it remembered that on this first day of May, A.D. 1869, personally appeared before me Elias Smith, probate judge for said county, Ruth Vos Sayers, who was by me sworn in due form of law and upon her oath, saith that on blank day of February, A.D. 1843, at the city of Nauvoo, county of Hancock, state of Illinois, she was married or sealed to Joseph Smith, president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, by Hiram Smith, presiding patriarch of said church, according to the laws of the same, regulating marriage in the presence of blank." Ruth states the sealing was performed by Hiram Smith, who did not accept plural marriage until several months later on May 26, 1843. Therefore, either the identity of the sealer or the date is in error. Regardless, Ruth Vos' sealing to Joseph Smith is especially important to understanding the practice of plural marriage because it is documented to have been for eternity only, not time and eternity, and therefore did not include sexual relations. Andrew Jensen, author of the 1887 Historical Record article on Joseph Smith's plural wives, recorded that, quote, "The strongest affection sprang up between the prophet Joseph and Mr. Sayers. The latter, not attaching much importance to the theory of a future life, insisted that his wife, Ruth, should be sealed to the prophet for eternity, as he himself should only claim her in this life. She was accordingly then sealed to the prophet in Emma Smith's presence, and thus were become numbered among the prophet's plural wives. She continued to live with Mr. Sayers and remained with her husband until his death," unquote. Another document corroborated that concerning Joseph's plural sealing to Ruth Sayers, quote, "Joseph did not pick that woman," unquote. Ruth and Edward chose to return to Boston, where they stayed until 1849. After their 5-year stay in Boston, Ruth and Edward moved to Utah, reuniting with old acquaintances. Edward died in 1861 and Ruth in 1884. Her obituary gives a glimpse of her demeanor. Tall and erect in figure, a countenance always beaming with human kindness, charitable to the poor, and ever ready to comfort the disconsolate. She endeared herself to her associates. She was a woman of brilliant conversational powers and possessed a ready fund of valuable information, especially upon topics of interest to the saints. She was never tired of relating incidents of her Boston life, nor of dwelling upon gospel themes and the days of Joseph and Hiram.
That was Brian and Laura Hales, co-authors of Joseph Smith's Polygamy, available in paperback and ebook from Greg Kofford Books. Thank you for listening to the Kofford Books AuthorCast. Be sure to subscribe and rate our podcast in iTunes, and like us on Facebook to receive the latest news about our authors and releases.